All right, get ready for a deep dive, everyone, because we're tackling a book that really makes you stop and think, New W, Pax Economica, left-wing visions of a free trade world.
A bit of a head scratcher, right?
You got it. I mean, it's free trade and peace. Don't those usually clash, especially for, well, folks on the left?
It's not exactly the most intuitive pairing.
Exactly. But that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. This book digs into the history of left-wing thinkers who truly believe in a Pax Economica, meaning peace through free trade.
And it's not some fringe theory cooked up recently. We're talking deep historical roots.
Seriously. How far back are we talking?
Oh, way back. The book takes us all the way back to the mid-19th century. Think the pioneers of free trade itself. And here's the kicker. It wasn't just economists pushing this idea.
Really? Who else was on board with this free trade for peace movement?
You name it, social reformers, feminists, even religious thinkers. It had a surprisingly broad appeal way back then.
That's wild. Back then, especially, you'd think free trade would just scream, look, another way to help the powerful. So how on earth did they even begin to link free trade with something like peace?
Well, for these early proponents, free trade wasn't just about, say, getting your hands on cheaper goods. It went way deeper. They saw it as a tool.
A tool? To do what?
To dismantle empires, not strengthen them. They actually believed protectionism was the real culprit, propping up colonial exploitation.
Hold on. Let's break that down. You're talking about things like the Corn Laws back in Britain, right?
Exactly. The Corn Laws, for example, forced colonies to rely on their colonizers for certain goods and markets. In their view, free trade meant liberation for these colonized people.
Okay, but for those of us who slept through that history class, can you give us a quick refresher on how the Corn Laws worked and why they were so controversial?
Sure. Think of the Corn Laws as tariffs on imported grain. Basically, it jacked up the price of bread to protect British landowners and farmers from, well, any competition.
So bread, a staple food, gets crazy expensive for the average person. No wonder people were up in arms.
You got it. And that's precisely why it became this rallying cry for free traders. To them, this was a textbook case of the powerful exploiting the vulnerable.
Now that you mention it, I can see how this ties into the anti-slavery movement brewing at the time.
Right. The book even dives into Harriet Martineau, this prominent writer and thinker of the era. She straight up compared these protectionist tariffs, like the Corn Laws, to slavery itself.
Whoa, wait, really? That's a bold statement. How did she even justify that?
Her argument was that restricting consumer choice and artificially inflating prices through tariffs was, in essence, economic oppression.
So, in her eyes, both slavery and protectionism were all about a select few benefiting at the expense of everyone else.
Exactly. Limiting freedom and well-being. And this really resonated with many who were already fighting against actual slavery. They saw the parallels, how these systems were used to exploit and control people.
That's a huge aha moment. It's mind-blowing to see all these different social movements finding common ground, uniting around this idea of free trade as this, well, force for good.
And it wasn't just Martineau. The book also delves into Richard Cobden, a major player in the Anti-Corn Law League. He was deeply involved in both the peace movement and the fight against slavery.
So he was the real deal. What was his take on all this?
He saw free trade as almost this divine law, this natural order that would lead humanity towards a more peaceful and just world.
So it wasn't just some economic theory for these guys. It was about morality, about doing the right thing. They truly believed free trade could build a better world.
Absolutely. Now, of course, the 20th century threw a bit of a wrench into this rosy picture.
A wrench is an understatement. I mean, you have 2 world wars, the rise of totalitarian regimes, all this chaos. How did those early Pax Economica folks reconcile all that with this idea that free trade leads to peace? Did this vision just crumble in the face of such global turmoil?
You'd think it would have, right? All that bloodshed and destruction. But here's the thing. For many on the left, the world wars actually deepened their conviction that no, free trade was the answer, not the problem.
Really? How so?
Imagine living through those times. The sheer scale of the violence, the billions dead, the economies in ruins. It was horrifying.
I can't even imagine.
Many saw those wars as the poisonous fruit of, well, aggressive nationalism and this mad scramble for resources.
So the opposite of cooperation and interdependence.
Exactly. Free trade, with its emphasis on those very things, cooperation, interdependence must have felt like a lifeline. Like maybe Just maybe, this could be the way to prevent another global bloodbath.
It does make you wonder, if we're all so interconnected, would we be so quick to turn on each other? Did that idealism actually translate into action, though? Did we see Pax Economica put into practice after the First World War?
Absolutely. In fact, this idea was front and center when they were setting up the League of Nations, the first real attempt at a global governing body.
So not just talk, but actual policy. They were serious about this. Did it work?
Well, that's where things get messy. As we know, the League of Nations couldn't stop World War II from happening, and then, of course, the Cold War added a whole new layer of complexity to the mix.
Right, because suddenly it's not just about preventing another war between nations, it's this ideological struggle, this global chess match between capitalism and communism.
Exactly. And that's where you see this split start to emerge. You have the rise of neoliberalism, mainly on the right, which, yes, embraces free trade, but it's all about deregulation, about shrinking the role of government, not so much about that social justice angle that earlier proponents were pushing.
So it's like free trade gets co-opted, becomes a buzzword for a different kind of agenda. What about the left? How did they react to this neoliberal takeover of free trade?
A lot of them started to get very wary. They saw free trade, especially in this new Cold War context, as potentially making global inequalities even worse.
Which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly an unfounded fear.
Right. The book actually brings up Cordell Hull, the U.S. Secretary of State in the 30s and 40s. Hull was a huge advocate for free trade, a true believer in Pax Economica. He even won a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts.
That's putting your money where your mouth is.
Talk about dedication. But even Hull, as passionate as he was, couldn't escape the realities of the Cold War, the way it reignited economic nationalism around the world. That dream of a truly cooperative world, a world united by free trade, well, it definitely hit a wall.
It sounds like the 20th century was a real roller coaster ride for this idea. First, you have this renewed faith in Pax Economica after the devastation of the World Wars, but then the Cold War comes along and everything gets muddled. So where does that leave us? What does the book have to say about the state of Pax Economica today?
The book argues that we're still living with the legacy of those 20th century shifts, for better or for worse.
So, not exactly a happy ending for Pax Economica. Has the left just thrown in the towel on this whole idea of free trade as a force for good?
Well, there's definitely a lot of skepticism out there. You can't ignore things like worker exploitation in those global supply chains, or the environmental impact of shipping stuff all over the planet.
Yeah, those are serious concerns.
Right, but it's not like a total abandonment of the Pax Economica ideal. Many on the left see its potential, but
there are some big buts.
big time. For free trade to actually work for everyone, not just a select few, it needs a major, major overhaul. A 21st century reboot.
A reboot? What would that even look like?
The book points to a few key things. First off, stronger global governance, like way stronger.
Because right now it's kind of like the Wild West out there.
Pretty much. The book argues that if we're serious about equitable and sustainable free trade, we need international bodies that can actually enforce stuff. Fair labor practices, environmental regulations, the whole 9 yards.
And make sure corporations aren't just playing countries off against each other, looking for the cheapest labor and the laxest rules.
Bingo. It can't just be about each nation trying to police these multinational giants on their own. That's never going to work.
So stronger global institutions, that's one thing. What else?
The book's also big on the power of grassroots movements, of civil society actually holding both corporations and governments accountable.
So it's not just about top-down policies, but about bottom-up pressure too. People organizing, raising their voices, saying, hey, we deserve better.
Exactly. Making sure those free trade agreements actually translate into tangible benefits for everyday people and communities around the world, not just profits for the already powerful.
I gotta say, it's hard to be optimistic about that kind of global cooperation, especially these days with everything so fractured.
It's definitely a tall order, but the book doesn't sugarcoat it. In fact, it ends with this really wild idea. What if we had a completely new governing structure? One where the US, Europe, and the global South are all truly equal partners, working together to create a more just and sustainable global economy.
Wow, now that's thinking big. But let's be real, is that even remotely possible in our current world?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And honestly, the book doesn't pretend to have all the answers. It acknowledges the huge hurdles, the political divisions, the lack of trust.
Yeah, to put it mildly.
But it also reminds us that throughout history, progress has often come from people daring to imagine a different future, even when everyone else thought they were crazy. The fight for a more just and peaceful world has always been about those who dared to dream big.
So maybe Pax Economica isn't such a far-fetched idea after all.
Who knows, maybe it could be one of those dreams that actually takes root and sparks real change.
It's definitely something to ponder. Well, there you have it, folks, our deep dive into the surprisingly long and often very bumpy road of free trade, peace, and anti-imperialism. We've gone from the 19th century dreamers to the harsh realities of the 20th, and now we're left with this question: what will Pax Economica look like in the 21st century? Hopefully this deep dive has given you all some food for thought and maybe a new lens through which to view this complex and always evolving topic.